start sort of this week thinking about, in particular, ascetics and monastics, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes because that's sort of my area of specialty. And then next week I will talk sort of more properly, once I've talked generally about what I think being a neighbor is for these folks with you. We'll talk next week about race and finances in some specificity, right? So we'll have some examples. But because it's a class, and in classes the way I work as a teacher is I don't lecture just endlessly because I think, you know, you guys have some pretty important things to share with me and I need to learn as well. I'm going to say some things and then we're going to talk and then I'm going to say some more things and then we're going to read together and talk some more. Does that sound okay? Sure. Yeah? That way you don't just fall asleep on this rainy day listening to me drone on. All right. So the first thing I'm going to have us do is, if you could just like raise your hand for me. Do you guys know, how many of you know anything about ascetics or monastics? Ascetics or monastics, so like monks?
Monastics.
I get like almost no hands, right? Right. This is always the case. Yeah. So I do something sort of unusual in my area of specialty, and I actually was pre-med at Illinois Wesleyan, which is where I did my bachelor's for the first half. So I sort of backed into being a religious scholar myself. And a historian in particular. I always joke with my students that I hated languages and I hated history up through halfway through college. Like nothing about any of my formation before I was about 20 would have told me that I would spend the rest of my life translating multiple languages and being a historian. So that is to say, I also always come as an ambassador of history in general. Like some people really like history, some people have had really horrible experiences. And I think it has to do with how you experience history. So the first thing I want to do, since I do something so strange, is I want us all to take a moment and just, you guys know each other, but I don't really know you. And I think this is a good sort of fun way to get us thinking about how strange ascetics and monks are, is I want you to each think of something really weird or strange that is like a thing about you that maybe other people in the room don't know. And then I want to think about who in this room might be brave enough to share some of those things? Who wants to tell us something unusual about themselves that maybe nobody in the room knows, even though you guys have known each other a very long time as a class? Yes?
I was a Civil War reenactor.
You were a Civil War reenactor. Very interesting.
I was the only person on a commercial flight one time.
The only person?
Only passenger, not the only person.
Yeah, I got worried there for a second.
No, but it was from Greenville. It was from Greenville to Charlotte, and I was the only passenger on the plane.
I bet that was an interesting
That was kind of weird. I was like thinking, boy, if this thing crashes, nobody's going to care.
That is an unusual thing. Thank you. Anybody else?
Matt and I survived a plane crash.
You survived a plane crash. Wow. Wow. That is an impressive. All right.
I dissected a mud puppy
A mud.
and a sand shark for an invertebrate zoology class.
Wow. You know, I had to give a rat a tracheotomy when I was still pre-med. It's a weird
Experience.
It is. It is. But important work. Others. All right, well, I'm going to give you one, and then I'm going to give you one more chance.
You had a tracheotomy.
What?
You had a tracheotomy?
I had to give a rat a tracheotomy. In a
for
biology.
a
No, not me. Not me. So I would be a bit more soft-spoken and probably slightly less dynamic. No. All right, so I wasn't sure I was going to get a full-time job, and so I thought I was going to join the Pennsylvania roller derby. So, all right. Anybody else? So this is good though, right? So this gets to some of this, right? Is what do we think about when we culturally think about being weird or strange, right? Notice the reticence of many of us to put ourselves on the line, right? That's not a thing we want to be culturally. Yes?
I ran my bike into the back of a parked SUV and smashed a bunch of bones in my face.
Oh my goodness, that is an unusual story. See, I'm glad you're okay though, my goodness.
Well, I'm all right.
Anyone?
Explains a lot, though.
These are who know each other better than I.
You were back here though in what, a week, 2 weeks? You weren't out very long.
That's impressive.
When you hurt your face,
Oh.
you were not out very long.
You mean unconscious?
No, I mean, you were here. You were back in circulation
So,
pretty
Yeah.
quickly after your accident.
After a stint in the hospital and a stint in healthcare.
well, I'm glad, I'm glad that you're okay. But then my,
Years ago. Go ahead.
yes. No, that's fine. But that's my point, is we tend to think culturally of being weird or strange as kind of negative, right? Like if there is a weird thing about you, which I guarantee there is, everyone in this room, right? There's a thing that makes you slightly different or something really unusual you've done in your past. We're very guarded culturally in our sort of modern context about what we're willing to share and who we're willing to be, right? And that means that sometimes we don't explore things that are also coded as weird and strange, which is why beyond being in a Protestant tradition, we tend not to pay a lot of attention to the ascetics or monastics, right? There are still modern day monks, but maybe they're doing something over there that's spiritually cool, but most of us are also like, that feels kind of strange in a sort of Protestant vein, right? So I want you to hold on to that thought, because we're going to come back to that. But I also want to say a bit about what I do as a historian. So everybody here has had some sort of experience in a history class, right? And some of you are history buffs and love it, and some of you are like, history is fine, it's kind of boring, right? Is that a fair assessment? But I think, as I said earlier, this has to do with how you experience history. And so part of the reason I got invested in being a historian is I got lucky and had a really good teacher in undergrad. And she caught me, right? And I was like, I took this class on Gnostic Gospels, and I was like, oh wait, there's this whole part of church history I know nothing about. And I'm an Episcopalian PK, so like I have no memories before my dad is in seminary. Like I've always been in the church. How could I possibly not know these things about the church when I like sat in on biblical Greek with my dad when I had sick days, right? Like how can this be? And so I got to thinking about what histories we tell ourselves, and that's how I became a historian, right? So I think history is important because I think history telling is actually an ethical act. So what do I mean by that? I mean that there are absolutely facts, right? There are things that are or aren't in the text. There are things we can or can't dig up in the desert, for example. But the story that we decide to tell with those has very much to do with who we are and what stories we want to tell, right? So we pick up facts or we ignore certain parts of the story because it tells a story about us. That is, I think that there are ways in which we as people, when we do history, pull from the past to justify our present and to construct the future that we hope for, right? That it's this very cross-temporal thing. It is also cross-temporal because I think when we stop and actually listen to our church mothers and fathers, our forebears, we learn something in a new context, right? So things seem very familiar to us. The Bible feels very familiar to us. But the historian in me would ask you to see even those stories that we read every Sunday in church as actually weird and strange and unusual. If you know something about them in their own context, you know that this was actually a pretty radical thing that was happening, right? So I want us to think about that because I think that when we do history, when you encounter something from the past, that's a cross-temporal experience that is intercultural. That is, early Christians, even though they bequeathed us this wonderful history, don't live in our own modern time. Does that make sense? And I think this ties to what I was talking to us about weird and strange, is we in our own culture think being weird and strange is not a good thing, right? We're hesitant to confess even to people we've known for years in a room, in church where we're supposed to be safe, right? And love one another unconditionally. We're still hesitant to share that part of ourselves. By contrast, in the early Christian world, being weird and strange was a sign of holiness, right? That was actually a sign that you were special and touched by God. And I think that is an important sort of intersection as we talk about ascetics and monastics this week and next. So, weird, strange, these are very interesting terms, right? And I think, as I said, history is about making meaning out of that information. I don't think, however, that should mean like domesticating and just putting it towards our purposes, right? That if we want to go back and listen to history well, we are always creating a story for ourselves, but sometimes we should listen to the things that haven't been in our story. So this is why, as a historian of ascetics and monastics, I'm intentionally I'm a Protestant in a Protestant seminary, right? We don't have a huge ascetic monastic tradition, but these folks were central, like absolutely central to everything that happened in the early church in the first 5 to 6 centuries. So if we want to understand where our tradition came from, we need to understand these people that eventually fell out. Now, I have a wonderful colleague, Catherine Shen, who's recently had a piece in this fall in the Massachusetts Review, and she uses this term to try and get around this historian. A colleague of mine, she uses the term radiant. Now, what do you guys think? Radiant. This seems to have a better sort of connotation than weird or strange, right? If I'd asked you, tell me one thing about yourselves that is radiant that somebody doesn't know, you're far more willing to share, right? So I'm going to ask you to hold that term radiant as a sort of synonym for weird or strange in the ancient world, right? That these folks were understood as radiant, and this is helpful because when people went to visit holy men and holy women, they actually thought they radiated, right? That they thought that they sort of literally oozed holiness, right? And you could capture some of that holiness and they might heal you if they touched you, right? Good so far? So ascetics and monastics. Have you guys even heard these terms before? Yes.
Yeah.
So what comes to mind when you do hear them?
Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, good.
Contemplative.
Contemplative. Yeah, absolutely.
Mysticism.
Mysticism. Okay, good.
Asceticism, a withdrawal from the larger community, a denial of self.
Yes, withdrawal, denial, absolutely. Anything else?
Somewhat crazy.
Somewhat crazy. Okay. Yes.
Wasn't it monks that rewrote the Bible longhand? And
Yes, they were the copyists, absolutely. They are the reason we have the manuscripts that we have, absolutely.
Introverted.
Introverted, yes. What else? Okay, no, this is a good list. So, what's interesting, right, is this lovely composite, but no, there was actually a great variety. So asceticism, right, is this larger sort of umbrella term that scholars tend to use, and it describes these people who chose this sort of withdrawn life, however they withdrew, and we can talk a bit more about that, and they denied themselves, as Carolyn sort of said, and within that there were monks, right, so monasticism is actually one tiny part of that large umbrella, and those are the people who chose to live in monasteries, right, so they chose to live in a walled-in community, usually together with other people who have made the same life choice, sharing meals in a common cafeteria, refectory, right? These sorts of things. But there were a lot of others, and I'm going to talk to you about those in a moment, but the thing is, again, they seem sort of crazy, except for these were the folks who picked up early scripture and ran with it, right? So what are they reading? Why did they think this was the way to do this, right? So the first things I'll say is asceticism as a sort of practice sits at the roots of early Christianity. So who else was celibate in the earliest church? Paul.
Jesus.
And Jesus, right? Like our two sort of founding, right? Jesus, on whom our tradition is based, and Paul, his big ambassador, who we use all the time, right? Paul's letters. Two of the founding figures were in fact celibate, right? They lived this sort of ascetic life, right? That they didn't live in traditional sorts of ways. They didn't settle down. They didn't have families. They didn't own a house, right? That they wandered, right? So that is to say, this thing that we tend to think is weird and often strange and crazy is actually sort of the root. It sits there at the root, and that's important to understand. In particular, right, these folks who followed in the model of Jesus and Paul were very interested in trying to wed together two important biblical passages from Paul, right? One is 1 Corinthians 7 through 9, right? Do you guys know this passage? This is, it is better to marry than to burn, right? So if you've ever read 1 Corinthians 7, how do you feel about marriage? Is marriage a good thing? Marriage is a very questionable thing in 1 Corinthians 7, right? Like, we can, modern-wise, think marriage is wonderful, but he has this sort of derogatory, marriage is the thing you do when you can't not have sex, right? Marriage is the thing that you do that you do in order to keep your passions in control with one person, but marriage inevitably means you can't focus fully on God the way I wish you would, right? Which is what leads us to verse 9, where he says, all right, if you got to do it, it's better to marry than to burn with passions and be distracted from God anyway and potentially sin, right? This is not a very positive image of marriage, is it? I mean, this is not the image of marriage I hold in my own life, for example, right? This is not like, oh, well, I got to marry that guy so I keep myself out of trouble. That was not how I thought about my marriage. But this is how Paul frames it, and people took this very seriously. And then they wet it with this other lovely Pauline verse from 1 Thessalonians 5:17, where you are told to pray without ceasing. So if in 1 Corinthians 7 he tells you you can't be married and pray without ceasing, but he's also told you to pray without ceasing, right? What are you to do with this? And so there were a lot of early Christians who took seriously that you couldn't be married, right? Or that if you were going to be married, all of 1 Corinthians 7, you should be married but no longer having sex, right? You should be in these chaste marriages, right? So that is to say that in some of this larger umbrella of asceticism, it isn't just people withdrawing and starving themselves and doing really strange things, right, that feel weird to us in our modern moment, but they were very much just trying to live out what they felt Paul's message was, right? Paul says this is what Christianity is, right? Most of early Christianity soon quickly becomes Pauline Christianity in particular. This must be what we're supposed to do, right? He gave us these commands. But how to go about doing that, Paul is less clear on, right? So pretty quickly you have what we call urban celibates, bless you, and urban virgins, right? So we had people who stayed at home. They don't move anywhere, they just stay at home, and they sort of slightly withdraw from society as much as they're able, right? And they began to live out this sort of more contemplative life, right? And they do, for very good reasons, actually do not feed themselves as much, because in the early Christian tradition, in medicine of the time period in which early Christianity emerges, control of food, right, controlled the humors of your body, right? So if you wanted to be in balance and able to focus on God, you didn't want to be overly full. If you've ever had a Thanksgiving dinner and been sort of sleepy afterwards, right, you know the risk of gluttony, right? And this was what they were concerned with. It wasn't about starving myself so I'm like wraith thin just to be extreme. What it was really about was control of humors, right? Control of my body so that my soul and spirit could be focused on God. So you had these urban celibates and virgins, and that's really our earliest form, right? These folks who are just living in the cities doing this. But then you begin to have these regional differences. You have the daughters of the daughters and sons of the covenant, which are like boys and girls who were like actually dedicated to the churches in Syria and seem to have been like sort of part of the choir. Their families would devote a child in the name of the family, right? And these kids would be raised in the church, celibate, right? And they would be assistants in the church. You had chaste married couples. This was actually very popular, right? As I just said, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, if you're married and you need to stay married, right, try not to have sex. But of course, even in the ancient world, they were very skeptical about you doing this, such that by the 4th century, the Bishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, is writing huge letters against this, right? You can't have people being like in these chaste marriages. Nobody's going to believe this nonsense. It makes us look foolish as Christians to stop doing this, right? We all know you're secretly having sex. You can't possibly be in the same household and not, right? It's this very sort of jaded understanding of sexuality, but it's this understanding that's still very worried about non-Christian views of Christianity, even once Christianity is the dominant church of the religion, of the empire. You have itinerant wanderers, right? So you have people who are wandering around, and they may or may not have like a trade, like Paul had tent making, right? And he wanders around. But you also had people who were taking very seriously passages from the Gospel of Matthew of being like the birds of the air and the lilies of the valley and don't care for what you need, right? It'll just come, right? And so they would wander from town to town preaching this message. So that's not very introverted, for example, right? That is a notion of being an ascetic that's in fact very social, right? So we tend to think about them as withdrawn from society, but we need to think also about what they're withdrawing from and why, right? So part of what's happening here is you have this community of folks who are trying to make a statement about society by the way they live, right? They're trying to make a statement about the way things should be and what Christianity tells them to be. Good so far? All right. Finally, you also had folks who thought that, you know, what this really meant was you could do superhuman sorts of things. So you had stylites and dendrites. And one of the books that Carolyn was listing, this translation that I did with some colleagues, tells this story of this dendrite. And what is a dendrite? It's literally somebody who climbs up in a tree and decides to live out the rest of their life in the tree. So you had people who would live on stylites, on big pillars, right? There's this famous stylite you may or may not heard of, Simeon, right, in Syria. A lot of this has been bombed now, unfortunately, in the last several years. But he stood on this pillar supposedly the rest of his life, mostly praying in the orans position, right, but occasionally getting down. And people would like pull up food and water to him, and he would pull up and down. And he was supposed to be holy, right? He was up higher, closer to God, right? And that conveyed a certain holiness around him. And people would flock from all over if they could afford to travel to him. And he would spit down onto the ground, and they would take the mud from his spit, the dirt, and they would put it on his eyes and be healed, right? A la Jesus, right? Like, these are stories that we're like, ew, gross. But when Jesus does it, we read it in the gospel, we're like, not. But this was something people thought they could do, that there was this continued sense of the Holy Spirit, right? That the parousia, right, was coming, but that we had the Holy Spirit still among us, right? So you have these folks doing those. And then finally, what becomes the dominant model comes out of Egypt. So this is where my area of specialty is, right? So first you have people who wander out by themselves. The most famous example is St. Anthony, right? He wanders out by himself. He's in the desert, supposedly in a cave all on his own, fighting these demons, being holy until the end of his life. And this is where we get this notion of them being sort of introverts, right? These people that don't like people, that don't like the world, right? And this brings me to the point of my talk, right? These are the folks, none of these folks seem very neighborly, right? If you withdraw from the world, what in the world do we think we mean by this language of neighbor? So you have the folks who are doing that, but pretty quickly, you know, even Antony, somebody had to bring him food and water, right? And we know that happens. Like if you read into his life, which exists in case you're curious, you can go out and it's a good English translation. The life of Antony, we know people came and visited him. And so you'd have disciples gather around you. And so like the place I was excavating that we were talking about before we started, we would have this little monastic site, and it would be one main big bedroom and two little sort of side bedrooms off it, or two bedrooms next to each other, and then a main prayer space and a kitchen to eat, right? So you had an Abba, a father, and his disciples pretty quickly. And this tends to be called Lavric sort of asceticism. And then you had these much more elaborate monasteries that were also beginning to form, right? That they were everybody coming together in a community. And it was really like creating a little city out in the desert, right? That you basically gathered everybody's resources and you communally took care of each other. So people got assigned tasks like you're the doctor, you're the baker, right? And most of the time, as best we can tell, those weren't utterly arbitrary. People came in with skill sets that they contributed to this new society. Does that make sense? So you have all these things. Now, the most famous sort of thing, other than the life of Antony, is the sayings of the Desert Fathers. Have you ever heard of these? Some of you? I'm getting a few nods. The sayings of the Desert Fathers is in translation. And they're these wonderful, pithy little sayings attributed to these folks living out in the Egyptian desert. And when they are picked up in our own time period, they're usually picked up for like, this is the wisdom of the desert mothers and fathers, right? And we go and we read for their wisdom. And that's a wonderful way of engaging it. But it's a way that indicates more about us as modern Christians, as modern people, than it does about how they understood what they were doing. That is, I like to sort of joke that this is like the way of taking an ancient text and making it a modern self-help book, right? That we do it for our individual spirituality, right? I'm going to go and read the Desert Mothers and Fathers, and this is going to make me individually, spiritually feel better, right? So this especially happens in like spiritual formation groups, and I go and talk to them, and I'm not making fun of that. That's one way of being. But I want us, the historian in me wants us to be really aware that that's our sort of projection of what we need from these texts. This is not what these texts were written for, right? So what was this really weird collection of pithy sayings written for, right? It was, on one hand, written to sort of memorialize a golden moment that had been lost, right? Which is a lot of what I talk about in my own research, like in my first book. It was also written as sort of a how-to guide to live in relationship with one another, right? That you gathered this wisdom together about how you do and don't behave when you decide to go out into the desert and become an ascetic. So, in particular, that seems very strange because, again, we've already sort of named that they don't feel very neighborly. But I think that has some to do with our own projections of what we think they're doing out there, right? We think they're weird, we think they're strange, so let's try giving them this term radiant. If we, yes?
You used the phrase golden moment lost.
Yes.
What was the moment that they lost?
So they're living out there wonderfully. I'll just very quickly. They're living out there wonderfully. Everybody's very holy, and then the second generation is a little less holy, and then the third generation is a little less holy than them. And then there's the traditional narrative goes that there's a barbarian attack, right? And there was a lot of sort of movement of various peoples who were quote-unquote barbarian, according to the Romans. But in fact, I argue in my book, this is my big thing, that we've been telling this story wrong for about 150 years, and in fact, most of the evidence indicates that there was a theological struggle, and that the Archbishop of Alexandria comes down and does a lot of violence, and he sets a bunch of cells on fire. And we know that this happens, but we think that's a minor thing, and that these barbarians do most of the damage. And I'm sort of saying, no, we need to think about it in the reverse, that the Archbishop wins, and so we have to gloss this history, right? This is a good example of like, we tell, even in our own moments, we tell back in the 4th, 5th centuries, we tell ourselves the stories we need to tell. So this golden moment was they're all living wonderful ascetic life, they're in community together, they sing the psalmody like the angels, and we have the inbreaking of heaven or paradise beginning to happen in the desert, and then this violent thing happens, and that they go running and fleeing, and the desert's never the same. People still live in it, but it's never the same.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yeah, Carolyn.
Is there any evidence to suggest why they chose the desert?
Oh, yes.
As opposed to living within, the confines of a city?
Yeah, so there are folks always living in the city, and this golden age story and the Saints and Desert Fathers and the life of Antony together sort of actually eclipse the fact that there's always this diversity. For like centuries, there's this diversity. So there are folks doing that.
Okay.
But the folks who go out in the desert, why do they do it? Again, this is part of what I argue. The desert is a place of power, right? The desert is a powerful sort of space that you're not supposed to be able to live in unless you're suprahuman, right? But that also meant that the demons live there. So the desert is a wilderness, and Jesus goes where? To fight the demons in the wilderness, right? So again, it was just part of trying to be like Jesus, right? That it wasn't seen as hubris, it was that they recognized they were not Jesus, right? But they wanted to imitate Jesus as much as they could. So it's like the ancient version of our what would Jesus do bracelets, right? We ask ourselves this question all the time as modern Christians, right? But that they were living that sort of more extremely than perhaps we do in our own modern times. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
If history is written by the victors, how does that fit into this whole paradigm? If history is written by the victors.
Yeah.
And
Well, the paradigm of what I'm saying about history?
of how the church is evolving. I'm thinking your Alexandria and your Egypt and the monasteries are telling it like they see it because they're surviving all the wars because they're keeping the records through history.
Well, the victors are allowed to tell history, but that doesn't mean other people didn't write things down and they didn't leave material culture, right? So no, this is a good question. So I talk with my students a lot about when we encounter a text or we look at a material object, you need to bring the 2 S's, right? Which is sympathy and skepticism, right? So if you feel like you're really drawn and agree to something, like you're like reading this ancient author and you're like, yeah, that is your marker that you need to stop back and be a little bit more skeptical, right? That there's this urge, you're reading the victor there, and you feel that victor, right? And similarly, if you read something and you're like, and this is what I'm doing here, right, with the ascetics and monastics, because we think they're kind of insane and weird and strange, right? And I'm asking us to think about radiant. That's our indication that we in fact need to read with more sympathy. And I tell my students that this is not just a fun like exercise for us, but this is at the heart, I think, of what we're supposed to do as Christians, right? Is if we're supposed to love each other and be in community as a bunch of really different people, and especially in our own political moment where we tend to sometimes be really polarized and not agree on things, right? Where I think history offers the most strong sort of intersection is this sympathy skepticism, right? Is when you read these things, when you look at objects from the ancient world and you practice these skills, you're practicing good listening skills and compassion and empathy, right? You're trying to understand the other person's perspective, and you're trying to recognize when you just align with somebody, you need to step back and think a little bit about what it is that's just making you feel good about you. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Anything else? All right.
Today, do we call it confirmation bias? Sort of bias.
Absolutely. That is exactly the way, yes. So yes, you have this sort of bias and it's confirmed and it makes you feel warm and fuzzy. And I think actually practicing historical skills, which is why I go and do this everywhere and why I teach, is because I think it sort of counters that, right? That if we don't just tell the story that makes us feel good, but we really engage the materials there, right? And especially the weird, strange, radiant ones, that we learn something different. And I'll say more about that in a bit. Did you have a question?
I would just back to your Corinthians 7.
Yes.
And idea of not having sex. I mean,
Yes.
that doesn't seem to be, people who were saying that. I mean, if everybody did that, then the human race would have.
And that was okay because the end was supposed to come.
It was just, was that?
Yes. We don't like this because the eschaton hasn't come, right? No, you're right.
Yeah, but it would just seem kind of odd that they would be perpetuating that kind of theory or that thought, because they're just perpetuating the demise of their own human being.
They are inviting in the eschaton. The apocalyptic revelation is coming. So we don't like that because we live 2,000 years after Jesus, and clearly we don't know when that moment's going to come. And we as a culture, with an exception of some small portions of Christianity, don't think about it that way, right? We don't think about like, the incoming could come any moment, be ready, right? We tell ourselves to be good in that regard, but we aren't like, this is a sign of the end times, right? We talk about this politically, and maybe we have moments where we're like, oh God, this could be the end times. But as a general rule, right, we don't think the world is coming to the end, like super soon, right? They really did. Jesus said he was coming back. Jesus said the end was coming, that the new kingdom was here. And for about 400 to 500 years, they really still expected that. And we have that culturally about every 500 years because of big round numbers, right? So we see this happen, this bubbles up again in 1000, it bubbles up again in 1500, right? Right around the Reformation time, right? And we saw this in 2000 with Y2K. The whole world was going to fall apart because our computers wouldn't flip over, right? That seems really silly to us now, 18 years post, but I remember being in college and everybody being like, we are screwed. The world is coming to an end, right? So yes, it seems really weird to us, but I would flip that. So part of what I'm asking, right, that sympathy skepticism is if it feels weird to you, we should flip on our heads and ask, what is it about us that they would think was really weird? And they would say to you, it's super weird that you think you want to propagate the species. Don't you want the kingdom to come? Right? And we feel uncomfortable with that because part of us are like, no, maybe I don't want the kingdom to come. I mean, someday, but I don't want to die. Yes?
So how do the Shakers fit into what you're saying?
So, well, I can talk to you more about that like next week, but the Shakers are a much later movement, right? So the Shakers come literally a millennia after what I'm talking about. But they are trying to get at some of these things and go back to them, absolutely. So, all right. So I want to make sure we get to the neighborliness part, if that's okay. So you guys have this handout, right? And at this point, we're at sort of Roman numeral 3, Desert Reflections on Neighbors and Neighborliness. So I want to say, and I've sort of said this, but I want to spend a little time with us, right? Because this is the frame of my 2 weeks with you, is we've sort of framed these folks as people who are supposed to be on their own, but they really aren't, right? I've already said, even when you're Antony living off in a cave, people are coming to visit you, right? That it is biologically impossible to be utterly on your own and utterly isolated, right? You always have somebody at least slipping you food through the door. But most of these desert fathers and mothers, and this is some of why I went out and dug, most of them are actually living in community. So you have an Abba and a disciple or two in one of these lavras, but they build up really quickly. So when we do like topographical analysis, we see that they like make little mini cities, right? Like, so even if they're not a monastery proper, people are drawn to people. And so to think about the ascetics and monastics, because they're criticizing the way society works as antisocial, which is sometimes how we think of these folks, right? These crazy antisocial people, right? That's not actually what they were doing. And they understood themselves as deeply in neighborly relationship. And they say a lot in the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, this collection of pithy sayings. They actually say a lot about how to be a good neighbor and stories of when people aren't. So they're not just beacons of individual spirituality. I think that they actually tell us a lot about how to be in community. And we think of them as not in community, and that's a sort of neat framing of them, right, that doesn't say a lot about the history of any ascetics and monastics, even modern monastic movements that still exist, right? The Franciscans, the Jesuits, right? We have the Dominicans, we have a lot of folks who have had major impacts on history for good and for bad, right? That they were very involved in their culture, even though they were supposed to sort of be withdrawn in this contemplative life, right? So you can never get fully out of the world. But when we think about this and take seriously this notion of communal belonging, you find these things, right? Like if we say, I'm going to pause and not just sort of take them as like insane, and we try to take them seriously in their own terms, and you read for this, right? You read for the things that are radiant, but also maybe very common. Then you find things like this saying that I've given you guys, right? From Abba Antony. That is Abba Antony, also said, quote, our life and our death is with our neighbor. If we gain our brother, we have gained God. But if we scandalize our brother, we have sinned against Christ. So what's going on there? Antony, he's supposed to be off in this cave, but he's not, right? He's in conversation with people. And he's very concerned about anything he does, regardless of how isolated he might be, that might upset his brother, including not engaging somebody who comes to visit him, right? Also, we know he doesn't live in this cave, that life is not true, right? He actually travels quite a bit around. He's supposed to have been to an important person at the Council of Nicaea, for example, right? That he has relations there. And we know that he visits and helps sort of establish some of these other communities that happen out in the northwestern desert. And so what that means is, after this, Antony becomes like the anchorite par excellence, right? Like he is the person you model yourself on. So in Augustine's Confessions, when Augustine decides to take up the celibate life, which we all like Augustine far better, right? Augustine seems okay with the Protestant tradition. Augustine is modeling himself on Antony. He hears passages from the life of Antony read aloud, and his heart is turned, he tells us in the Confessions, right? So even like probably one of the most prominent theologians from this time period is influenced by this tradition, right? But that doesn't mean that you just ignore your neighbors, right? And so we have these several other passages, and what I thought we'd do for the last several minutes, if it's okay with you, is I thought we'd talk about them together. You guys can ask me questions, you can tell me what seems sort of weird, strange, radiant, but I also want you to think about what can we know about neighborliness here? So we have, yeah.
10 minutes. Good time.
Notice, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have, what, B through I here. Tell me what you think. Yeah,
I'm taken by C.
okay.
Instructing one's neighbor is for the man who is whole and without passions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, without passions, of course, is, the antithesis of what we think of social interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So, it seems like a strange relationship that they're advocating be created, that it be totally rational, totally in the model of Christ.
Yes. But what does he go on to say? Because what's the second part of that?
Or what is the use of building the house for another while destroying one's own?
So this is a recognition of precisely what you're saying though, right? Like you shouldn't be like telling your neighbor how to live their life until you are perfect, right? That passionlessness is a goal, right? Because the passions are what get us in trouble, right? We fall in love with somebody, we do something stupid. Many goods can come from that, but we also do a lot of stupid things, right? This is like all of like the narratives that we tell culturally about teenage love, for example, right? That you're gonna be foolishly in love, right? That we have that notion. But anger, sorrow, when we act out of these places, right, that aren't like compassion, right? So passions here is this sort of ancient notion of emotions that take control of your body, right? And it was in fact tied, some of those harsher ones were tied to notions of demons that might sort of attack you. And we can talk more about that next week, because I want to sort of contain us, but his point here is that we're not going to succeed at being passionless, right? So I like to think about this one as what I tell my oldest son, right, who always wants to help his younger brother, super cute, right? But I'm like, until you have taken care of yourself, don't take care of your brother, right? So quit putting on your brother's shoes until your own are on, right? And this is like because we had several weird airplane stories today, this is like the airplane mask thing, right? You put your own mask on before you help the next person, right? And so his point here is, until you are perfect, you shouldn't be going around bossing around your brother, telling him how he ought to be out in the desert. So, did I see?
I was about to say that thing, how passions are tied to the flesh, so like anger and lust
Yes.
would have been seen as the same thing. So by being passionless, it means that you have it in check. Like,
Yes.
you can still feel it, but you have to understand it for what it is.
Correct. And we do, we still teach these sorts of things, right? Like we teach, because I have young children, I've had this whole new perspective, right? Like we do in fact spend a lot of time enculturating ourselves as a culture into like, well, you don't just act out of anger. You don't just, I know you feel sad, but you have to figure out how to manage that emotion, right? And that's really what they're asking for with passionlessness, right? The passion was an excess of emotion that wasn't in check. absolutely. What other ones? Yeah.
B
Yeah.
just seems to promote the idea that we hear a lot in church today about it's all about community,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's the found this was all meant to be done, we're all done in community. So then I jump down to H,
Yes.
and it says, you know, the old man said to brother Abba, if it is good to praise, if it is good to praise one's neighbor, then the old man said it is better to be silent.
Yes.
That seems to be like let's praise your neighbor I'm not understanding that, because then the flip side, I say, well, no, don't praise your neighbor, just shut up.
So what do you guys think? I think this is a good question, right? So, yeah.
I think that's a good comparison to I, where the abbot says, one should bow before the brethren who come, because it is not before them, but before God that we prostrate ourselves. So like, don't praise the brother without praising the God inside of them. He's making that distinction.
I knew it would take a young person, and the youngest person in the group to
All right.
solve that for me. I didn't even see I there, that's the only reason I didn't.
It flips on the final page then. What do you guys think? Does that satisfy you guys? Is that satisfactory or no? So, others. What do you
Was that
think?
the right answer?
I don't think there is a right
All right,
answer. I think there are definitely wrong answers.
Right. Well,
But no.
but if you just took H without I, let's say I wasn't here.
But if you took H all by itself, right?
Just, I mean, that wouldn't seem to promote the whole idea.
Well, what's the risk
Community.
of, so let's think this through, right? When you think it, because I think this is a good example of thinking through communal relationships. So what happens when you praise your brother? How do you feel?
Good.
It makes you feel good about yourself too, right? Right? Is that very humble?
No.
No. And what's the risk if your brother feels puffed up by you praising him?
Vanity.
Vanity, right? So it's not that you never say anything kind, right? But that even if you aren't thinking with your focus always towards God, right? In the like this connection with I that we had, there's this real concern that even these relationships where it seems like you're doing a good thing, right? Have these sort of payoffs that we have to be real careful of triggering, right? So they're not saying never say anything good about your brother. That's not what they're saying, right? But if your choice is between praising most of the time or being silent, you're actually really at risk of creating this system that makes you feel really good about yourself because you're making everybody else feel really good about themselves and they think they're just like the most wonderful thing since sliced bread, right? That it creates a sort of puffed upness that is different than authentic sort of appreciation, right? And that's what they're getting at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but that's a hard balance to strike, right?
It is a hard balance to strike. And they would agree with you, right? That these are incredibly hard balances to strike. Any others you want to talk about here quick? Yeah.
I want to ask you how they lived. In other words, 33 years is the average lifespan, and they have to pass this on to the next generation. They all have to get it and carry it on, keep the monastery going.
Yes.
So how does this work evolutionary based
Yes.
on?
So people live longer than 33 years in a lot of these cases, partially because they are living very healthy lifestyles. Right? Like that's the funny thing for us to think about is like we think about them starving themselves and being really insane, but most of them are eating very conservatively, right? They tend to be eating vegetarian. So we know culturally, right, like modern medicine tells us if you lower your caloric intake, the older you get, the more likely you are to have a longer lifespan, right? And that vegetarian lifestyle actually probably is likely to lengthen your life. So it's funny that they in fact knew things in an entirely different medical system, but that it actually matches a lot of what our recent medicine has said. So a lot of them are living longer, right? But part of what happens is you have an Abba, the sort of figure that's considered more wise, and then they tell these things orally to their students. So the sayings of the Desert Fathers actually only get written down in Palestine, outside of Egypt, after this golden moment is ruptured. Right? So when people go fleeing, then we need to write it down in written because we can't have this oral community. So it was all about sharing. It was an oral culture primarily that shared oral wisdom. You did have folks who wrote and copied things, and we have some of these that were written down already in Egypt, but very few of them. So that's how this sort of keeps going. You're welcome. Anybody else? All right, so I want to take this last couple minutes, right? Because I've sort of given you a lot of examples of them being neighborly, and I've given you positive examples. So I'm going to totally betray my hand here and say that if you went and read the Saints of the Desert Fathers, you'd also hear a lot of stories that would indicate that they, just like us, could be a really crappy neighbor sometimes, right? That you have, for example, this story of John the Little, who has this lovely piece about the foundations that we just read, right? John the Little hears two brothers fighting in the church, and he runs back to his cell, and he circumambulates it 3 times, right? Trinitarian number here, to try and clear his head of this argument he's heard because he doesn't want to be poisoned by it, right? That they had this real notion of contagion where, you know, when you see 2 people being crappy to each other, and we still do this culturally, right? You see 2 people being crappy to each other, it makes you feel kind of crappy about humanity, and then maybe you're sort of grumbly at the next person. Or conversely, right, the pay it forward movement, right, that's happened the last couple decades. You see 2 people do a really nice thing, that person paid for your Starbucks, you want to go do something good, right? That they had exactly the same sort of notions of community that we do. And that they recognize, and actually I think this is the point, they do recognize that this is an incredibly hard balance to strike. That we aren't ever going to be perfect or passionless. And this is why I think they're a good model for us of community, is they were very honest because they were trying to be critical about society and self-critical, right, as part of the self-denial, right? They were very good at highlighting the cultural places you might have hiccups, right? Places that we don't even always think about being dangerous, right? Praise seems like it should be a perfectly good thing, but if you actually start to play that out, you begin to understand with them what the actual risks are, right? And what things can seem good and lead to bad. Does that make sense? So we have this notion of neighborliness from them, actually, from these folks that we would never think of as neighbors. And so I think the next question for us is what are the limits of that definition, right? Because this is the flip side, right? I'm not asking you all to go out and become ascetics, right? We're not going to all just go out and be just like them, right? So this is the sort of thinking cross-temporally as interculturally. We've encountered this culture that's very different from our own, and yet this is our Christian heritage, right? How do we think, what can we take from this, and what is just not importable? What tells us this isn't going to work, right? What are the limits of that definition? But also, this is a 2-part question, right? What are the limits? But thinking about a group of people, of these individuals in a different way, in this radiant sort of way, how does that stretch our own notion of what the neighbor is? So what do you guys think? What are the limits, and what ways can we maybe expand our imagination about what we mean when we say being a good neighbor as Christians?
To be resolved next week.
Yes. You like how I did that? I am
Good setup for next week.
I am in fact a professional. Well, thank you guys so much.
Very much.
Thank you. I hope so. I hope you guys